wasn't here.
No, is that Sunday?
Do you have
I think
any?
it's Friday.
This last Friday or this Friday?
Oh,
I think it's
okay.
Friday. Oh, you
Anybody remember, right?
Was it paying attention?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
So
that's
the big joke was going to be, who was paying attention, right? So I don't know, maybe nobody's.
To paying attention.
Yeah. So we were, we're discussing the fact that, we, like as as Muslims, a lot of times we will have a goal that we need to achieve, and the Quran will tell us, do A and B and C, or do X, Y, and Z. But because the Quran is a book of guidance and not a book of instructions, it often doesn't tell us how to do it. It tells us what to do, but it often doesn't tell us how to do it. And even with the life of the Prophet ﷺ, for some things, like Allah may say, well, aqimu salat, right? Establish the prayer, make the prayer. And then we can look to how the Prophet ﷺ, how did he pray? Okay, we can look at his life, see how he performed the prayer, and do that, right? But then you have other things in the Quran where Allah will say, fattaqun nar, right? Protect yourself from the fire, or fattaqu yawm, protect yourself from the day of judgment, or udhkurullaha, right? Remember God, right? But doesn't tell you how to do it, right? And even the Prophet ﷺ may not necessarily tell us how to remember Allah. Now, he may give us hints or other things along the way. So the point is that for some of the things that we need to do, we're going to have to think a little bit about it, right, of how to accomplish the goal, because it may not be 100% readily apparent. So we talked last week about the topic of attention. And what is attention? In English we have phrases like pay attention, right? And we talked about how, attention essentially is like, it's something that's like in between one of your senses, like maybe sight or hearing or taste, and almost like a reflex, right? In that it's something that you have to train yourself to do. We talked about how there's, in some ways, there's like two kinds of attention that we have. We call voluntary and involuntary attention. Voluntary attention is like usually the thing that you're trying to pay attention to. And involuntary are those things that like you just kind of, you react to. And we said, the world we live in is full of distraction, right? Everything from, electronics to, traffic, advertising, media, you name it, even to where we said, we live in a noisy world. We live where, like we said, when the fan is running or there's always some sound, right? So there's always something that pulls at our attention. And therefore, it isn't so much of paying attention and not paying attention, but it's what you're paying attention to. We said, ironic, in a certain kind of way, you're always paying attention to something. It's just you may not always be paying attention to either what you want to pay attention to or what you ought to pay attention to, right? So when you're distracted from what you want or ought to pay attention to, it just means you're directing your attention somewhere else, or it's being pulled in another direction, right? So that was how we kind of talked a little bit about the process, right, of attention. And we talked about some verses in the Quran, how, the Prophet ﷺ, one of his objectives was to not only purify us, وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ, right, as Allah says in the 62nd chapter in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, that he sent the Prophet to what? Purify us, to teach us knowledge and wisdom, right? So in some ways, the habit of paying attention, in some ways, is beginning to tread on the path of wisdom, of hikmah, sometimes what we call. Because hikmah, hakama means to be able to make a decision. It means to be able to look at more than one thing and decide what is the correct thing, what is the right thing to do, right? This is why sometimes in traditional Muslim culture, the doctor will be called a hakim because he can look at you and decide what the issue is, right? You may have some symptoms and he can figure it out. Or the judge is the hakim who will, people bring a dispute. He has to figure out what's right, what's wrong, who's guilty, who's not guilty, has to make, right? So he's going to make a decision, right? So attention for us, we can start to think of like, first off, what ought we be giving our attention to, right? There's so many options, so many choices. There's so many things that we can give our attention to. Part of that will be deciding, well, what is the goal first, right? Then once I have the goal, what do I do? What's some of the steps that I can take to get there? So continuing in Watson's book called Attention, she shares one story of a famous, he's like a neoclassical musician. His name is Philip Glass, if you're into music, right? So he gives this interesting anecdote. He talks about attention as a habit, meaning that, you tend to pay attention to what you are used to paying attention to. So like you might wake up in the morning and the first thing you do is you check your phone. That's what you give your attention to. Whether that's email, whether that's Facebook, right? I mean, this is not about guilt, right? I'm just saying, we all do this, right? I do it, right? You wake up in the morning, your phone's right there. I try to sometimes make it a habit of leaving my phone downstairs, but then I also sometimes use my phone as an alarm clock. And so anyway, 9 times out of 10, our phones are in proximity to us, right? So when we wake up, we have a habit to check it. And I think particularly, I got in the habit of checking my email when I wake up, because when I worked in IT, you'd wake up and I'd always have to see my boss was sending me something, or maybe the server was sending an alert or whatnot. So I had to check my phone. So because of that, I kind of just got into the habit of checking my phone, even though no longer I work in IT, right? I mean, I'm an imam. I wake up at, 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. There's no message in there at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning that I need to really deal with anymore, right? That life is gone, and yet I still have the habit of doing so, right? So he talks about attention as a habit, right? Which is important because it gives us a clue, an insight in, what it is that we do. So he says that he was, he's this world famous musician, and for him, music just isn't a passion, it's his job, right? So he's got to be able to do music, kind of like on command. And that can sometimes be, very difficult. So he said that he found that in order to retrain himself, to rehabituate himself to paying attention to what he ought to do, is that he set aside 10 minutes of every morning, right? Or I said from about 10 in the morning, not 10 minutes, he said from about 10 in the morning to 1, he made himself just sit at the piano. Because, for him, that's like, it's like me working in my IT cubicle, right? So he would sit at his piano from like 10 to 1. And he would force himself to sit there. He couldn't leave. And in the beginning, he's like, man, sometimes nothing would come into my head. I couldn't think of a single note of what to play. And in the beginning, it was very frustrating because he had become habituated to doing some other things. So he's trying to break this habit. And he said, the first week was like really painful. He would sit there and he couldn't think of anything what to do, right? And he said he felt like an idiot. Here's this world famous musician, and yet he can't just sit down and start writing music. He said that, however, he stuck with it because he realized that this was kind of like going to the gym, right? The first visit to the gym is going to be painful, right? It's not going to probably feel that great. But he said eventually it began to change. He began to feel this change in himself, in his mind, right? And he says, I started writing music, eventually got to the point where I just started writing music as something to do. He said, then after a few weeks, I found that it transitioned from this like madness and frustration, right, to a point where it eventually, he developed the ability to give his attention to what he wanted to do, and it became easier. And he writes, he said, from then on, he said, the habit of attention became available to me. And I think that's and so I bolded the word available. Sometimes our attention isn't available to us to direct it to what we want to do because we haven't trained ourselves, right? And that's the idea. It's like it's something you want to call up, almost as if attention were like a servant, right? You want to call attention and direct it to what you want to do, versus like, you know, how I was probably like a really horrible employee. I was always looking for some way to like not do, you know, whatever my job was. But that gives a really important insight. So for as Muslims, right, what is it that we ought to be paying attention to? Coffee? What'd you say, coffee?
She's half asleep.
You know,
I said everything related to our faith.
well, okay, but that's very, you know, that's very loose, right?
To our actions, our
Right.
Something we have to pay attention to. What we
Our
do.
actions, right? Okay. But then even that becomes, and the reason why I'm going through this exercise, right? So we say, well, anything related to Islam we should pay attention to. Okay, but that's still not actually telling me what to pay attention to. So it's very loose. It's what we call, you know, amorphous. It's a fancy English word, right? It's too loose. So you say, oh, I should pay attention to my actions. Okay, that's a little bit more refined. What
the
actions?
most important things. I
Right?
guess.
There's all kinds of actions you can do, right? So maybe part of the helpful thing, right, if we take the lesson here that she writes about, you know, there's all kinds of things that a musician does, but he made himself do one thing and stick to it until he was able to bring his attention to bear upon it. So maybe in just saying, well, I need to be a better Muslim. Okay, well, sure, but that doesn't give me much to work with. Maybe we should pick something in particular. Like, I want to read 1 page of Quran a week, or 2 lines a day, or whatever. That's something a bit more particular. And then once you have something to particular do, then it gives you something to focus on, something to pay attention to, right? So, you know, part of habituating ourselves, it's like, you know, training anybody ever own a dog, right? You train a dog, right? You don't just say, hey, be a good boy or be a good girl. Like the dog's like, I don't speak English, what does this mean, right? You have to tell the dog, like, sit, right? Or stay, or whatever. You give it something particular. You don't just say, hey, dog, work on your actions. Right? The dog's like, I don't, you know, what do you mean work on your actions, right? But you give it a particular action, the dog can be trained to do that. So I think for us, you know, getting to the practical part of this is that each and every one of us needs to maybe drill down a bit more specifically and pick something. So maybe for you, it will be, I don't know, A. For you, it will be, for, you know, Roxana, it will be C. For me, it'll be, we might all have something different. But I think we need to move towards something more specific than something less specific. We already have the specific, or the generalities in the Quran, right? Like, you know, right? Remember me, I will remember you. Okay, fine. Allah, you know, God says, remember me, and I will remember you. How? Right? I need, like a dog, right? I need a biscuit. I need a treat. I need a string. I need something in particular, right? Now, we might be tempted to say, like, okay, the salah. That's good. Obviously, we want to do the salah. But the salah, well, at least mandatory-wise, is only how many times a day? 5. How long does the salah take? How long does the prayer take? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, right? So if you have umpteen number of minutes in the day, but let's just be generous, right? 5 times 10, that's barely an hour, right? So if we have 24 hours in a day, all 5 prayers together is barely, I mean, probably most of us aren't even doing a whole hour of prayer throughout the day, but I'm being generous. So that leaves 23 other hours of the day, 7 or 8 are for sleep. So what do you do for like the other 10 or so hours a day? right? You got to find something specific to do. Otherwise, you'll just do whatever the lazy part of your nafs, right? The what I call the employee part of your nafs. The employee that as soon as the boss ain't looking is going to just slough off and do whatever he or she wants to do, right? I know that's what I have done probably majority of my life. But because although in some ways, I don't want to put myself on a pedestal, but like people will ask me, right? How did you learn Arabic? Because obviously it's not my native language. How did you learn Arabic so well? Well, it wasn't due to a talent. People say, oh, you're really good at languages. You speak like 5 languages. Okay, but how did I learn to speak 5 languages? Did they just jump in my head? No. Maybe I have a little bit of a talent more than somebody else, maybe. But I can tell you myself, it came through a lot of repetitive discipline, right? I mean, to learn any language, you gotta learn grammar, you have to learn some vocabulary, and neither one of those, I mean, it takes discipline, sitting and writing and dictionary and conjugating verbs and all that, right? It essentially, we have a term, in music, like you go in the woodshed, right? I mean, it's like you go in your workshop and you just whittle away at something, right? You focus and it's a discipline and you concentrate. So the only way I learned Arabic was through, repetitive discipline. It wasn't one time. So it really has far less to do with talent and more about an attitude and a willing to commit to doing the same thing over and over, right? Doing drills for grammar or for flashcards, for whatever, right? In the same way, if whatever habit or whatever action that we would like to focus on, pay our attention to, then we need to realize that it's going to require some dedication and in particular repetition. I think this is where some of this stuff today, all this, this kind of screen stuff, is it eats away at our capacity for sustained attention, right? Because, when you're online on this thing, right, there's always, it's like, even if you're reading a web page, there's like a little ad over here doing something, and all of a sudden some music starts playing, and it's just like, oh man, like your attention is actually like divided, right? You think it's one thing, but it's actually divided. And it's so easy to go from one thing to the next, right? I know myself, like, I've gone to look up something on the web. Oh, I'm on Wikipedia. Oh, there's a link, there's a link, there's a link, there's a link, there's a link. And I went from looking up something about like Sahaba in the 1st century of Islam to like, I don't know, what brand of cat food, it's like just all of a sudden some random nonsensical, like 10 links later, I'm not even remotely on the same topic, right? I'm like looking at how to make guacamole or, gluten-free guacamole or something. And I started off about like tafsir of Surah Yasin or something, right? You just suddenly, so you have to be aware that this stuff is a little bit like your enemy, which is, not to say you will do the same thing. For me, that's why I read a lot offline, right? This, kind of like what he's saying, to be honest, when I was in IT, I was probably like most other people. I would just kind of graze and graze. But then, when I took this job, I was like, man, I really got to read, and I've always, for the most part, been a pretty serious lifelong bookworm. But when I first began to read, I found this extremely difficult because nothing's moving, nothing's flashing, nothing's beeping, nothing's making any noise. So I look at this, and it's like, I'd get to that. Oh, let me look what it's like. Man, I had to train myself of like, you know what? Even take my highlighter and throw it away, because I would get out the highlighter and this and that, making notes. It's like, man. Then it's funny. I would actually highlight, and then I'd go back and I'm like, man, what was this book about? I was too busy highlighting and underlining that I wasn't just giving it its due. Yeah, I'm focused on highlighting and, right? So now my habit is, if I'm going to read the book, I'm going to read it twice. The first time, I'm just going to read it through. The second time, I will then, maybe take some highlights, some notes, right? And I found that to be a lot more productive. The other benefit of reading books in particular, or at least print media, not online media, is that even though in the beginning it may be like pulling teeth, after a while it becomes a lot more meaningful. And therefore, I think this is why, Muslims don't really read Quran, to be quite honest, because you're not going to get that book if you're constantly doing this, right? I mean, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. Like, what is the Quran, right? I was listening today about some show it was about Christians, and they were talking about the Bible and like science and this and that, and for whatever reason, they were like two groups of Christians were arguing about whether science belongs in the Bible or not, or belongs in church or not. It's like, then you have Muslims that say, oh, the Quran is a book of science. I've heard many Muslims say this. I'm like, really? Where's the experiments? Because science, right, requires experiment. You have to be able to duplicate, right? This is something called scientific method, and it has to be reproducible, right? If it's not reproducible, it's not considered, right, solid science. And yet the Quran, like when Allah says what? خَلَقَ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, right? He created the heavens and the earth. Allah doesn't say how he did it. He just says, I did it. Either you accept that he did it or you don't, right? This is why Allah says, right? For the one that believes, then he believes for his own benefit, and if he rejects, then he rejects to his own detriment, right? Allah does not explain how he does anything. Matter of fact, he says, that he creates, right? خَلَقَ الْأَزْوَاجَ كُلَّهَا. He created all of the pairs, right? Some of them, how they things that grow out of the earth. وَمِنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ وَمِمَّا لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. And in some stuff, you just don't even know how it's done. So the Quran is not. This is nothing against science. Science is useful, but the Quran is not a book of science. It's a book of guidance, right? It's what, like morality. Don't do this. Do that. Be kind to people, hold your tongue, feed poor people. That has nothing to do with science. It's a book about what is ultimate reality, there's this life, there's another life, there's an unseen world that you can't see, right? There's this life, next life, and then what? Like, I've provided for you, go feed some poor people. Use what I gave you to go and give to somebody else, right? This has nothing to do about repetitive, reproducible scientific experiments.
But there is some ayat that talk about science, like how to create, how insan was created.
But that's not science, right? He says, min turab, right? Kaif min turab.
Yeah.
No. Kaif min turab. How did he create man from?
Yeah, but some of the surah they talk like in detail how.
This we would call like
how
tabaqat
insan was created.
or darajat, like in stages, right? Min turab, or khalaqa kulla shay min hayy. He created everything from water. How? He doesn't say how. He just says, I did it. When he says that I created man from what? Turab. I created man from, let's say, dust. He doesn't say how I created it. Science would, I want to know how he created it from dust. That's science. And therefore, we want to put it in a lab and reproduce it, right? This is not science, right? Scientific method is something very, very particular and limiting. This is why science cannot be religion. It doesn't have an issue, but just science is not guidance, right? So for us, the fact that Allah created everything from water, right? There's no kayfiyah, there's no how to. It's just a declaration. I created everything living from water, or I created man from dust.
Isn't Scientology a religion? Like a religion of science?
Well, Scientology, yes, Scientology is a religion. Is it a religion of science? I will leave that for the Scientologists to answer. I think it's more like a religion of some crazy people in Hollywood.
Yeah.
But I mean, it has the word science.
It has the word science in it, but it's not science. It's like the Nation of Islam has the word has Islam in it, but anybody that believes that Elijah Muhammad is a messenger of God or Father Muhammad is God incarnate is not Islam. So just because it has a name attached to it isn't. So. What is Scientology? I don't know. If you're free, go to LA tomorrow. They have that big. You can go downtown LA and check it out. I'm sure they'll tell you what it's all about. It has something to do with like pharaons, and you got to get like your demons exorcised out of you or something. I don't know. So it's some crazy stuff. But the point being is that since the Quran is a book of guidance. Therefore, what we're paying attention to isn't science experiments, right? We aren't double checking to make sure that God followed the correct, procedure, or that there's an internal review board looking over his research, right? Is that it's for what ought to I be doing with my life, right? And that covers many things. What I ought to be praying, I ought to be feeding poor people, I ought to be visiting the sick, I ought to be reading the Quran, right? These kinds of things. And therefore, I personally feel that it's more helpful to look to a particular thing, because you can get overwhelmed. I got to do all this stuff. Okay, I mean, obviously you should do your prayer, but throughout the day, again, we already said, the other 23 hours of the day, what are you going to do, right? Now, yeah, you got to work, you got to earn a job. Matter of fact, how does one keep one's mind on one's job, but also be mindful of God at one's job, right? It's not this, well, I go to job, I forget about God, and then when I'm off, I punch into the mosque and I punch out and I punch into the office. It shouldn't be like this kind of mentality, right? And I'm not talking about sitting at your desk with like dhikr beads and, I see people doing this and it looks a little strange of like literally trying to work with the dhikr beads at the same time.
How can you put
You
thinking at the same time working and thinking about sometimes?
Yeah, to the point where, this isn't anything about like the tasbih or the dhikr beads being haram. This is not. I don't want anybody to misunderstand that, right? But this is a good example. You can have the tasbih or the dhikr beads, right, in your hand, but if your mind isn't on that and you're just, yes, I'm not saying that if you say your, 100 Allahu Akbars a day or whatever, I'm not saying that you don't necessarily get the barakah of saying those words, because according to the Prophet ﷺ, you do. So nobody can argue this. But for those other benefits, right, I think in some ways, if you want to actually really train yourself, right, train yourself to be able to count to 100 on your hand, right? The lazy, that's even for myself, I have many nice sets of dhikr beads, but I've actually found it more beneficial to try to count to, when I want to do that dhikr, try to count to 100 on my hand. At first, I keep like losing track, like where am I, right? And then I worry like, well, is that such a big deal? If I'm saying like Allahu Akbar and Alhamdulillah and Subhanallah, and I'm meaning it, well, whatever, who cares if I lost track at 55 or 72 or whatever? The fact is, if I'm really doing it for Allah's pleasure, and over time, you'll improve your memory and be able to focus more. Because part of the reason why we use the dhikr bead is what? It's just like, I don't have to pay attention to what I'm paying attention to, right? So if we're talking about trying to train our habits, right? This is what all this is about. Trying to train our habits, then and make attention something like a service that you can call up, right? It's like, maybe when you want to go somewhere, you call Uber as a service to take you somewhere. So attention in some ways is like something you want to be able to call and use at the appropriate time, right? And I think that will be easier to do if you start with something specific. So like last week, I don't know if anybody did it, I had suggested a great way to maybe get some insight into what your habits are like. Track your food for 1 week. I don't know if anybody did it, right? But I had said, they have all these great, some of them are free. There's like My Fitness app, that's free. I think there's Chronometer, which is like a couple bucks. Anyway, you can find like a free food logging thing. You can scan, it's great. Like you can scan the barcodes on stuff that you, right? And you track your food, right? It's a great way just to see like get an insight into your habits. And like, are you really eating out of hunger? Are you eating for nutrition? Like, what are you eating for? Because a lot of times you just don't pay attention to what you're putting in your mouth, right? Even though we live in this like, totally food obsessed society, it's a good mean. So I don't know if anybody did it, but I did it. And the first 2 days I was actually quite alarmed because, I'm a type 2 diabetic. So naturally, I need to really watch what I'm eating and drinking. And after 2 days of going back and keeping track, I suddenly found like, wow, I really need to make some changes because I'm eating things that are I should not, or drinking things I should not be drinking, right? And that I'm missing off on some things. So it really, this week, allowed me to get back on track with some of my diet, even though I already thought I was doing pretty good, right? That's the thing with attention. You think you're paying attention, but once you start paying attention to what you're paying attention to, you will suddenly find out that you really haven't been paying attention to the right things, right? And that's what, really what we're talking about. Training yourself to pay attention to the things you ought to pay attention to. So maybe for like everybody's homework, mine included, this week, find one thing from a Muslim perspective, a so-called Islamic perspective, whether that's reading Quran, whether that is, be conscious of when you pray. I remember years ago, when I did a class like this, and I there was a bunch of people, and I asked people to raise their hand. How many of us, when we go to pray, when we get to maybe like the fourth or fifth ayah of Al-Fatiha, we suddenly realize, oh yeah, I'm praying. Like how many of us, we begin, we say the takbir of ihram, and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, maliki yawmiddin. It's by the time we get to, ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, it's like, like one of the guys, he's like, man, this is crazy. Like every time I pray, sometimes I can't remember if I started at like literally like the fifth ayah of Al-Fatiha, because I just go through it like a robot, and then I kind of like, oh yeah, I'm praying. Which is crazy, because it only took you probably 8 seconds to go from, you had to know what you were doing when you raised your hands to make the takbir of ihram, but within a matter literally of a couple of seconds, your mind drifted and then came back at Sirat al-ladina an'amta alayhim, right? And we were just talking about 5 or 6 ayats, 5 or 6 seconds, and yet even for that small period of time, it can drift and come back, right? And I know, during the salah, especially if you don't, I would say if you don't speak Arabic, then it has an extra level of challenge. Although even people that do speak Arabic, I see a lot of people's mind wandering, right? I usually have the luxury of having to lead the salah, which isn't a luxury, but it does force me to have to pay attention because everybody's following me, right? So when you're in the habit of following an imam, sometimes you could just lay back and just let the imam kind of do his thing and oh, we're bowing, okay, we get into these habits, and even myself, especially if I have a lot on my mind or something, my mind can wander and come in. This is just, I'm saying, be honest and be particular. Be honest about what you need to work on, and then be particular. Don't just say, oh, I need to work on my actions. Okay, yeah, we all need that. What action? Find a particular action, right? And keep track of yourself in some way. Find some means of keeping yourself honest, right? Like maybe keep a little journal of how much Quran you read. You don't have to even write down what it was about, but what surah and what ayat did you read? Keep that little journal. I'm telling you, you will go through a period of depression, and I'm here for you, Wednesday through Sunday for counseling. You will be like, oh God, is this all I'm reading, right? Because I tell people all the time, I can't live your Islam for you. I'm just an imam. Right? I'm just like you guys. I'm made out of dirt, just like the rest of you. So you have to read the book yourself. I can be a resource, maybe to help you understand its meanings. Maybe not. I don't have all the answers, but I can't read the book for you, right? And it doesn't matter English, Spanish, Arabic, whatever your language is, right? Read it so that you really, really do develop the habit of paying attention to that book. You can't talk about wanting to do Islam, be a better Muslim, any of this stuff, if you don't have a habit of reading that book.
At least restrain yourself to read at least 1 page a day.
Oh, half a page.
You can get
What? Yeah, I would even worry about the finishing, like the Khatm al-Quran. I wouldn't even worry about when you finish. Just worry about, did I get to it today?
Did I understand it?
Yeah, right? And if you're going to read, this is why, personally, If you want to do it, it's up to you. Like in the month of Ramadan, I have no idea why people who have no relationship with the Quran any other month, I mean, it's good that they want to read Quran, but then they just speed read. I'll have to finish the Quran this month. So they're like, did you understand anything? No. Then what? I mean, ذلك الكتاب هدى, ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين, right? It's a book. There's no doubt about the book. And what? It's a guidance for people who are trying to be pious. So if it's going to be guidance, it's like, it's like instructions. Don't be like the typical man, like myself, when you get a piece of furniture delivered to the house. I don't need to read these directions. And then like 5 minutes later, I'm cursing and telling my wife, hey, give me a hand putting this thing together, right? Read the instructions slowly, right? It will benefit you more, right? Be patient. It would be much more beneficial and perhaps even establish a feeling of habit if you actually read it slower, because then you're paying more attention, right? So a couple of ideas just, maybe for this week to do, keep a journal of what your reading of Quran is. Not that it makes you have a panic attack of, well, God, I'm not reading it all, but at the same time, like, well, this is where maybe some of your focus needs to be. If you're a person that's praying 5 times a day, okay, cool. What's next? It's like, you go to the gym and like you'll see a guy who's like got huge arms, but he's got these little toothpick legs. Like, hey, money, I think you could probably leave the curls alone. Why don't you try some squats, right? It's funny because you see just like they've really worked one body part where, okay, we get it. You have big arms, right? But you've got these little toothpick legs. Well, let's go work on another body part, right? To be, more rounded in the same way. So if you're, not to say that you can't go on and do other of the nawafil, the extra, prayers, but maybe you're a person that is committed to the prayer but just doesn't read the Quran a lot. Or maybe you're a person that, reads the Quran but doesn't ever visit like old or sick people, right? There's always some area you can round out more, right? Well, and it's missing because you're just not paying attention to it. Right? You're letting your attention be dragged into other areas, especially, again, the nafs loves complacency. The nafs loves, Allah says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ لَا يَرْجُونَ لِقَاءَنَا, those that have no hope in meeting us, وَرَضُوا بِالْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا, and they are happy about this life, وَطْمَأَنُّوا بِهَا, and they are satisfied. That's the nafs, right? Then they're what? غَافِلُون. They're people who are just, they're heedless. They have no attention span, right? So try to be honest, find things that, maybe an area you're a little deficient in, right? Something particular, get away from the generalizations, get to something particular, and find some means of helping to keep yourself honest to it. That's why, in some ways, like my social media, people are like, man, you post what you eat, you post your wall. Through like every couple of weeks, I'm like, I can see what I'm doing. I'm not just putting it out to the world. It's a good means of keeping track. So, that way we can, in the end, be a bit more honest with Allah, right? Being honest with ourselves, with what we're doing, that's the real acid test of how seriously am I taking Allah? How seriously am I taking Him at His promise, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ? Every soul will taste death. How serious am I about that, right? How serious am I about utilizing the time that I have and I don't know what my allotment is? Could be another 20, 30 years, could be another 2 days. Where am I at on my scale, right? Helps to just keep us more, keeping yourself honest. If you're doing it in the right way, well then it's really about what your relationship is with Allah. Any thoughts, questions?
Just curious to know if you have any program during Ramadan to, because I personally never read the Quran, the whole book.
Sure.
I'm not ashamed to say it. And I really want to do it in a way where I go through every mentally not only go through every single verse but understand it. Because that's my biggest thing is, although I learned Arabic growing up, I don't really understand it well, and I don't like the English translation. It has to be like something really reliable.
Mm.
So do we have any program where we're gonna go through every single page of the Quran? I would love to do that.
During Ramadan, it would be, because so there's, roughly 29, 30, let's just say 30 days in Ramadan. That means we would have to go through a juz a day. Now, what I do, like, so, there's 30, you could divide the Quran up into 30 parts,
Okay.
right? Al-Jazā, the 30 parts of the Quran, right? Now, to do 1/30th of the Quran per day as a lesson would be very difficult,
Yeah.
just in terms of time-wise, right? Now, what I do every day is give usually a short talk, in between the Isha and the Taraweeh, right? And I will usually pick one thing from that section to talk about for a few minutes. Now, I do have a companion website I can send you that has essentially a sort of thematic summary or highlights from each section, and I can give you that, which might be a good companion to start, and then you can read through and then look at that to make sure, okay, these are like maybe the main things that I'm kind of getting from it, right? But to be quite honest, that's only gonna come from whatever elbow grease you put into it.
Yeah. No, that's what I want to do this Ramadan is really go through it and.
No, I
not
do.
just read
I
it,
do
but
have. If you
understand it and take notes and.
if you want a recommended translation of the Quran in English, I can give you that. For French, obviously, I'm not going to be an authority,
No, I understand.
but I have some good recommendations of translations that I can give you in the English language.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I want to make efforts, of course, because I really want to understand it in Arabic. So that's obviously I have to retrain myself on my Arabic.
Right. Any other thoughts, questions? Good to go?
Just curious. You said earlier that in Quran it says that we're made of dust, and then you said water. What is it that's you're talking about? Anything that's non-living or anything that's non-human being and an animal?
See, these are, Allah says we created every living thing from water. Right. Now, in some ways, most living things on some whatever cellular level, right? Most cells are made up of, or in part, water or somehow, some way, right? And that goes back to my point. Allah doesn't give descriptions, He just gives declarations, right? There's a very different thing to say what? I created, وَخَلَقَ الْجَانَّ مِن نَارٍ, right? I created the jinn from fire, right? Okay, like, how do you create a living thing from fire? It's not explained, right? It's done, right? And when it says what? When Allah wants to create a thing, what? Kun fa yakun, right? Kun, be, and it is, right? That for us, in sense, you could think as created things, we live in a world, sometimes they call it, we live in the world of means, right? Like if I want a glass of water, I gotta get up and I gotta get that water, right? But then I can only get that, like where did that water come from, right? Water has to literally come down from the sky. Well, where did the sky come from, right? All these things going back to something else. So I need some means of things, right? Allah doesn't deal with means. He just deals with what we call irada, like whatever Allah wants, right? Kun for you, whatever He wants, He just says kun, and it is. Be, and it is. So it's a different, to be reductionist, it's a different set of rules what applies to Allah than to us. Not to say that rules apply to Allah, but in a very simple reductionist kind of way, we have to deal with rules, right? If I want money, I gotta get a job, right? I just don't get money. I can't just say kun fil bank. I can't just say be money in my, that'd be great, you know, but it doesn't work that way, right? I have to, some other things have to happen, right? So this idea of, again, or even when Allah says that He made it a human being, there's actually many things that He said that He made the human being, from water, from turab, which we describe generally as dust, from teen. What is teen? Now they will say it's clay, but in some ways also, like, teen is teen, meaning like, we don't know what it is, right? And then salsal, right? What is that? They say, well, it's like black mud. Well, okay, I don't know. I mean, we have a dictionary and you can look these things up, but originally, what did these words mean? Number one, they weren't necessarily explained even to the Prophet ﷺ. It's just, this is what you're made from. It's like when you go to the store and you look in a box of something and you think like, oh, these crackers are made from wheat, but then it's like deoxyribonucleic, hydrogenated peroxide or so. It's like, I don't know what that means. That's what it's made from, right? So the idea of trying to get down to some specific, I think this is the beautiful part, is we don't really know what we are. Because even as a human being, they say what? For every quote unquote human cell in our body, there are 10 cells that are microbial. It's like a 10-to-1 ratio. So in some ways, we're actually more microbe than we are human. Matter of fact, if you took all the microbes out of our body, we would die. We wouldn't be able to digest. There's like a whole number of functions that we do that are critical to our existence of living, at least biologically, that are foundationally required. They depend on microbes. So what am I? Am I a microbe? Well, I don't think so. But clearly I'm also not just, the definition of human is very elusive, right? And then Allah says what? On top of all of that, وَنَفَخَ فِيهِ مِن رُوحِهِ. He blew into him something of his ruh. Because we have two things. We call what? We have ruh, and then we have nafs. What is the ruh, and what is the nafs? The nafs is described at least in 3 ways in the Quran. Amara bisu', mutma'inna, right? Like we have like these 3 aspects of the soul, or I guess you could call it the soul. But then we have like a deeper soul that's called the ruh. The nafs changes, right? You can become disobedient, you can be happy in obedience with Allah, right? The nafs can change, right? But the ruh doesn't change.
What's the nafs in English?
Soul, spirit, maybe, right? And the ruh, right. But then we would say spirit for nafs, but then how do we translate ar-ruh al-Quddus? Right? Jibril alayhi salam, the angel Gabriel, is described as what? Ar-ruh al-Quddus. He's like the Holy Spirit. We don't call him the Holy Soul. That sounds a little strange in the English language, right? So again, these words are not exactly precise, but they are not synonyms. This is the important thing. Nafs and ruh are not synonyms of one another. They are 2 different things.
Well, because Arabic is the richest language and as far as vocabulary, so I'm not surprised that you have all those words.
But even then, it might be rich, but it's not rich because of the Arabic only. It's also because, if Allah had revealed the Quran in English, it would have been in English that Shakespeare would have been knocked dead by, right? So it isn't just, that it's the Arabic language, it's also that Allah revealed His kalam, His speech in that language, right?
I asked you that question about the dust, dust.
Well, there's, let's
water,
say,
and maybe 3 or 4, because I just ran into something on the.
this is also what min nutfa, right?
What's nutfa?
Like, in some ways you could call it like sperm, but it's also like the seminal fluid, right?
Yeah.
So the creation of man is very complicated. And again, man isn't anything without what وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, right? I blew into him something of my spirit. So without that,
No life.
then it's just hayawan, or maybe just
Yeah.
mate. You could be either animal or just dead, right? So it's a very, it's an there's a part of us, and it's true. You look at every other animal on the planet, every other organism on the planet. We are totally different. I don't care if my DNA and a chimpanzee are 2 chromosomes apart, right? I don't care. At the same time, right? I'm clearly, I'm not a chimp, and clearly a chimp ain't me, right? So all of this wanting to make us like, well, basically we're just apes. Not exactly, because no ape can do what I can do, right? And I can't do what apes can do either, right? Like I just, can't pull myself up with one finger or, do all kinds of crazy things that apes can do. But more clearly, like no other human being, no other organism on the face of the earth is like the human being.
It's in Surah Baqarah.
No, I'm just saying, it's very apparent, right?
God asked Malaikas
Yeah.
sujood ila Adam,
Right.
ila Iblis. That means human beings are special.
Yes, we are. There's something very, very particular. And it has nothing to do with brain. I mean, look at the dolphins, right? Dolphins and whales are all, they have this big brain. but
Like a human brain.
Dolphins haven't figured out how to get out the ocean, right? Like they have to hold their breath their whole entire life,
Follow-up question, I don't want to
Yeah.
forget it. This is something I've always wanted to know, and I've read about it, and it depends on what you read. During the development of the
Embryo.
baby,
Uh-huh.
when does the ruh enters the body?
So this is there's a debate about this from the fuqaha. Some will say that it's immediately. Some will say 40 days. No, I mean, there's difference of opinion, right? Meaning that there's no agreed upon time, right? There are some say no, when a law creates the human being, that instant. This is a lesser opinion, but some say, after 7 days, 40 days. Like there's a difference of opinion of when and
There's no really like a
Because it's
common.
there's no called ijma', like there's no consensus upon
It's not
this.
even close because like from the beginning and then you have 7 days, 40 days.
Yeah, so there's no consensus about when this happens.
Interesting.
Yeah.